So let's talk about the right of publicity. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So among the various rights that an individual has is the right to have their likeness, and that includes their name, their image, their identity, voice as well in some states. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's identifying of them, right? They have a right to control how that's used for commercial purposes, right? So I want to say that, first of all, that even within the U.S., it's going to differ from state to state what these rights are, but in general, there's some common themes about how it goes, right? So a photographer or videographer might be allowed to take a photograph on the street or take their video on the street and even capture that person because that person doesn't have an expectation of privacy where the photograph is being taken. But then that doesn't mean that the photographer has a right to use that photograph or sell the rights to that photograph and allow for the person who appears in that photograph to be used as part of some sort of marketing campaign.
But you can give a release to that person to sign, and then you can use those photos, right?
Right. So the release should have the individual waiving those rights, not just the right of publicity, but all these other rights that we're talking about, that the fact that they're probably being paid for the appearance in the photograph, if we're talking about models, that they're waiving all these rights. And then they're also allowing the creator, the producer of that content, to sub-license rights in the content, right? So
okay.
That's just
So
because...
it's not only for one publicity, but it's also can be resold, right?
Right. So I mean, there's a difference, right, between you inviting me to participate in your blog versus a photo of this conversation being used to advertise Coca-Cola, just as an example, right?
Yeah.
So without my consent for that, right? So
As
yeah.
I understand, there are two types of releases you can give to a character or a model to sign. First of all, it's only for one campaign, or it can be resold. Like, for example, Shutterstock, right? You give the release, as I understand, you give the release to a model and she signs, and she understands that this photo will be resold many times. Or sometimes there is another release where you just sign that it's only for one campaign. Is that correct?
The rule is that if people agree to it in writing, it's almost certainly going to be enforceable, right? So the question is, what does the piece of paper say? There might be a broad release that says that this is all the rights that you're waiving in exchange for whatever it is I'm paying you, right?
Yeah.
And this can be used for any purposes whatsoever. Then the person that produced that content, they can control how that content is used, and they can sell it downstream as well, right? They can sell it to some marketing agency to use in whatever. They can sell it to a company. It doesn't matter. And the person who appeared in that content can't do anything about it, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
On the other hand, well, if there's no release, then again, maybe you were allowed to take that photo in the first place, and maybe you're still even allowed to use that photograph, for example, for news reporting, for really First Amendment related issues, right? That, again, the public has a right to know, or that there's really a society benefit from being able to use that content, right? And identifying that person in the content versus using it for some sort of private commercial purposes. There's a difference, right? So there's that right of publicity. And so the scope of the release or the absence of a release can govern all of that.
Okay, makes sense.
And it's also important to note that in many states, not all states, but in many states, the right of publicity can only be granted through a written consent.
Oh.
So bloggers and influencers, let's say, who are walking around creating content by filming it on the street, which they have a right to film, right? They have a right to create that, let's say.
Yeah.
They might ask on camera,
If the
hey,
person...
can I film you in this, right? And the person might say yes on camera, right? And that's perfectly fine, let's say, for content that is not itself a commercial for something.
If it's only for my blog.
If it's content for the blog, even if it's being monetized, like it's okay that the content itself makes money, right?
Yeah.
But then if it in turn becomes a commercial by itself, so think sponsored posts, right?
Okay.
If you're an influencer and you've got sponsors and they're sponsoring a particular post, and there are people that appear just on the street when you filmed it,
Yeah.
now that it's a sponsored post, it's
okay.
a commercial for that other sponsor's product, right?
Yeah.
And
Now makes sense.
now all of a sudden the right of publicity comes into play for the person that was captured, and you don't have a written release, which might be okay in some states, might not be okay in other states, and
That's why you need a lawyer.
you've got the internet, right? So of course the best practice is get these consents in writing to cover as many situations as possible. Then there's also the question of false light. There's the doctrine of false light, and that relates to a person's right not to be portrayed in a false light. Sorry for the circular discussion there, but an example for think about all the clickbait articles that you might see at the bottom of any internet page that tries to get you to click on it, and it says, "Guess who was arrested near you?" And it shows a picture, maybe a mugshot, maybe just. There's a difference between mugshots and just any pictures, but let's say it shows a picture of somebody, and that person is not.
Not the one who
I
was
mean,
arrested.
right. You don't actually know if that person was the one that was arrested, right? But it's next to that headline, and it creates this potential false light situation, right? Think about also if your business, for example, is a psychiatry business, and you're showing pictures of people on your blog just from a photo that you have a right to use the photo, but there's not necessarily a consent from the individual to be portrayed on a blog about mental health and people that have problems with their mental health. So showing that person in that sort of light, if they aren't actually being, if they don't have those issues, that can be a false light problem with the doctrine of false light.
Okay, so now let's talk about fair use. What can you tell us about that?
Sure, other than that it's just the most complex portion of all of copyright law in the US.
Yeah, I was reading a lot of that and I couldn't understand. So that's why I asked you about that.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue that we can talk through, and also it is often misunderstood. But there's a couple of things that should be just known ahead of time. One is that this is truly a case-by-case analysis for every single situation, whether it's fair use. We can talk about kind of some very broad things, but ultimately every single time that somebody else's content is used without permission and the creator wants to rely on fair use to say that they're allowed to use that content, that will need to be looked at carefully in every single situation to try to figure out whether that's actually true or not. Also, it might differ from, again, location to location, not necessarily state by state, although that's the easy way to say it. Copyright law is actually federal in the US, and so there are different circuits, so it's not necessarily state by state. I don't want to get too deep into
So you want to say that in most of the states it's the same, right?
There are some principles that are going to be common really throughout, but also just the analysis really needs to be looked at carefully. So the concept of fair use relates to, again, this thought about the whole point of giving anyone any protection is to promote the progress of science and the creative arts. That's in the Constitution, in the US Constitution. That's one of the purposes of what the government is supposed to do. It's supposed to promote progress of science and the useful arts. And I might have butchered that, which would be embarrassing, but the gist is correct. The thought is, okay, we want to give people exclusive rights to give them some sort of incentive to create, right? If we just said, whatever you create, all of society owns, that's going to remove the stimulus and the incentive for somebody to become an artist and create. At the same time, there's this broader goal of promoting science and progress and whatever useful arts are, right? And so if somebody has created something that there's really a big societal benefit to that content being used, even if the person didn't grant their permission to use that content, then maybe fair use might apply. That's where that doctrine comes from.
Wow.
Now, very rarely is it going to come into play when you're just using somebody's content without doing anything with it, okay? There's this wall behind us that's pretty colorful, and it's art, right? Somebody created it, all these various parts, somebody drew it. As a painting, it would be protectable. And here we are using it just because it looks cool in the background, right? At least before we started talking about this, that was the case. And that would not have necessarily been fair use because we weren't actually doing anything with the content to make it worthwhile or to add to society's benefit, even though we were talking about something that was educational, hopefully. Just because of that, the background could have been anything, right? And so that probably would not have been fair use if we were sitting here for an extensive amount of time just using it as a pretty colorful background. But now we're using it as as the subject of the educational piece. And so that will help convert it toward fair use. Now there's still an analysis that has to be done, and in the U.S. there are 4 factors that are analyzed to see whether they are whether fair use exists or not. And those fair use factors, the first is the purpose and character of the use. Then there's the nature of the copyrighted work, the substantiality of the work that's used. I think I butchered that, not quite correct, but how much is used, right? And then also the effect on the market for the pre-existing work. So the purpose and character of the use, that has several different components. There's one component that questions, okay, how transformative is the secondary use of the first use? There are some types of uses that are, have a presumption that they might be transformative, such as teaching, such as education. Parody is one of those things as well. Parody?
What is that? Foreigners don't know that.
Right. So using content as the subject of a joke, but not just, that needs to be distinguished from satire, which is using content as part of a joke, but it's not the butt of the joke, so to say, right? So if you're not actually, if you're just using a song because it sounds cool and you're rewording things, as opposed to using the song and commenting on it, criticizing it maybe, that would push it into parody. But commentary and criticism are the 2 very common areas where there might be fair use. Also news reporting.
What about news reporting? What can be wrong with news reporting?
So just very, very similar, right? Just because content is used in a report doesn't automatically make that fair use. On the other hand, if the subject, if there's a commentary about a gallery, for example, if there's a new opening of an art exhibit and there's works that are being shown in a news report to create that news, it would be fair use of that, right? If we were analyzing this work and talking about the merits of it as a work of art, whether we were saying it's awesome or whether we were saying it sucks, the fact that we were showing it to convey that point, that would have been, that's a very simple, good example of what's fair use, right? Nature of the copyrighted work is the type of thing that courts don't really pay too much attention to. They do look at whether it's, how creative is it? If a work is published or unpublished, that a lot of the time matters. Unpublished works get a little more protection than published works because they haven't been released yet. And so they should have some more protection, right? Also, going back to the first factor, other than the question of how transformative a secondary use is, there's a question of whether the use is commercial or not-for-profit. Again, just because something is not-for-profit is not going to make it fair use. Just because something is for teaching or even, we'll say, criticism or anything like that, or news, right? It doesn't automatically make it fair use. You have to still run through this analysis that we're going through, and some factors might weigh in favor of fair use, other factors might weigh against fair use, and you can't have this categorical statement of if I'm using it in an educational scene, then it's fair use, right? So the amount and substantiality of the work that's used it has a quantitative component, it has a qualitative component. How much are we using and how important is it in the original work? So even though you can't see the entire work behind us, we have been using it quite a bit, right? It's been here the entire video, and in other videos, it's a big part of those other videos in the background. And quite frankly, we probably used it more than we should have to be able to claim fair use for other segments where we're not discussing fair use. The reason we feel comfortable using it as a background is because I know the artist, and I'm sure they would be more than comfortable with us doing so. And also we're in a particular location where we have permission to be filming, including permission from the artist to be able to be doing this. So, by the way, Nate Azark of 12 Line Studio, that's his work from prior engagements that he's had, and I'm doing that on purpose, giving a shout out to Nate, because giving somebody credit actually goes in favor of fair use. Although it's not always required, doing so helps support that, and we'll probably give a link to Nate as well. Okay.
Of course.
So, but that's a large reason for why we started to film here, is because of this fair use question. The final factor that gets looked at is effect on the market. How much does our use supplant whatever potential market the owner has? So does our using this background in this video, does it somehow negatively impact the potential of selling this artist's work? There might even be an argument that it might benefit their work, but again, these things will be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So as a general rule, if you're using the content as a subject of whatever it is that you're talking about, not just as attractive additional material, but actually discussing and analyzing and adding something new to the perception of a particular piece of work, then that really increases the chances that there's fair use. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot more questions for a bunch of other situations.
So guys, if you have lots of questions, you can contact Ilya and he will answer them, but also he can help you to do all the paperwork. When you create some content, you need lots of paperwork. So he's the one who can help you with that. Guys, I think that Ilya answered lots of questions which are really useful, and I'm really thankful that you joined my video production and you answered all these questions which are really important even for me, because I'm a foreigner. I didn't know lots of stuff, so thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Sure, thank you.